prospect that 2/3 of the world's population will have no access to fresh drinking water by 2025 has provoked the initial confrontations in a worldwide battle for control over the planet's most basic resource. When Bolivia sought to refinance the public water service of its third largest city, the World Bank required that it be privatized.
This Bolivian example of Cochabamba is undoubtedly a very dramatic one about the privatization of water, but it's important to point out that corporations are in conjunction and cooperation with governments are working to bring water services, fresh water services, under their control all over the world, including in the United States and Canada.
La gente debía optar por una decisión de comer menos, pagar del agua, pagar por los servicios básicos, dejar de mandar a los niños a la escuela, no asistir a los hospitales y curarse en la propia casa, o en todo caso gente jubilada, por ejemplo, que tiene una renta muy baja, debería buscar trabajo en las calles. Del agua es nuestra, carajo. La gente sale a las calles, sale a los caminos y protesta, ¿no?
The price this beleaguered country paid for World Bank loans was the privatization of the state oil industry and its airline, railroad, electric, and phone companies. But the government failed to convince Bolivians that water is a commodity like any other.
Entonces, ahí sí vimos que el gobierno defendía los intereses de la transnacional Bechtel, porque la gente quería agua, no gases. La gente quería...
This story illustrates a number of things. One of the things it illustrates is that people are not necessarily going to put up with and be duped by these attempts of corporations to basically take over everything. But another thing it shows is how the New World Order, the new economic order in the world, sort of the institutions of globalization like the World Bank and the IMF and WTO, are having an impact on the lives of people, a profound impact on the lives of people. And in this particular instance, it was actually the World Bank that had put pressure on Bolivia to privatize its water services. Basically, the World Bank is owed money by these various developing countries and requires the countries, as a condition of extending loans or of forgiving certain aspects of loans, requires the countries to take austerity measures. In other words, to roll back various kinds of public involvement and various kinds of fiscal involvement in creating a public infrastructure. So it's under that pressure that a country like Bolivia is effectively pushed into the position where it invites a large company, Bechtel in this case, to come in and provide water to its citizens on a commercial basis.
There was an interesting connection between the rise of fascism in Europe and the consciousness of politically radical people about corporate power. Because there was a recognition that fascism rose in Europe with the help of enormous corporations.
Mussolini was greatly admired all across the spectrum. Business loved him. Investment shot up. And suddenly when Hitler came in Germany, the same thing happened there. Investment shot up in Germany. He had the workforce under control.
I think what this story is really about, I mean, you have large American corporations applauding Mussolini. You have large American corporations. You have General Motors. You have Ford helping to build the German army after the Nazis have taken power. It just demonstrates this sort of amoral nature of the corporation that, if there's profit to be made, then it will be there. The question of allegiance to a particular country or to a particular system of political ordering, i.e. democracy, that's not an issue. There is no capacity within the sort of the corporate mind or the corporate framework to say, we prefer democracy as a matter of principle, so we're going to pull out of Nazi Germany. They can do that, but only if they say, well, we can make more money under democracy, or our business is being hurt by being involved with, say, South Africa, or being involved with the Nazis, so we have to pull out. But essentially, there's nothing that allows, within its constitution, that allows the corporation to say, we are not going to support this pernicious political system. Quite to the contrary, the corporation will go where it can make money, and if it's IBM, and that means selling and leasing equipment to the Nazi regime that they full well know is going to be used to run the slave labor and extermination programs that the Nazis have in place, well, so be it. The Nazi regime is a customer, and profits are there to be made.
Millions of people of all religions and nationalities and characteristics went through the concentration camp system. That's an extraordinary traffic management program that required an IBM system in every railroad direction and an IBM system in every concentration camp. Now, this is a typical prisoner card. There are little boxes where all the information is to be punched in. We compare this information to the code sheet for concentration camps. And here you see Auschwitz is 1, Buchenwald 2, Dachau is 3. Now, what kinds of prisoners were they? They could be a Jehovah's Witness for 2, a homosexual for 3, communist for 6, or a Jew would be 8. Now, what was their status? 1 was released, 2 was transferred, 4 was executed, 5 was suicide, and 6. Code 6. Sonderbehandlung, special treatment, meant the gas chamber or sometimes a bullet. They would punch that number in, the material was tabulated, the machines were set, and of course the punch cards, by the millions, had to be printed, and they were printed exclusively by IBM, and the profits were recovered just after the war.
I really do believe that that particular accusation has been fairly discredited as a serious accusation. That is, the fact that they have used equipment, that is a fact, but how they got it, how much cooperation they got, and any kind of collusion trying to connect dots that are not connected, I think that's the part that is discredited.
IBM wasn't particularly happy with how their vice president performed in the interview. I guess they thought that perhaps the company could have been better defended, but in any event, they wanted the tape of the interview back. And I was sitting in my office out at the law faculty one day, and I got a call from Chris Komisarjevsky, who's in the film, who's the CEO of Burstyn Marsteller, who is, I suppose, IBM is a client of theirs, and he was calling on their behalf to suggest that they were upset with the interview and they wanted the tape back. And I suggested to him that we might be able to do that if IBM was prepared to offer up somebody else. I mean, we would have been happier to talk to the CEO of IBM or to any sort of high-ranking management type who was informed about the story and had something to say about the story. So I offered that, suggested that if they were willing to pay the expenses for the crew and whatnot to go back and talk to somebody else, we could do that in exchange for the tape. And after that conversation, we never heard back from either IBM or Burstyn Marsteller, so I'm not sure what happened there.
I'm not saying that Watson didn't know that the German government used punch cards. He probably did know. After we had very few customers. Watson didn't want to do it. Was not because he thought it was immoral or not, but because Watson, with a very keen sense of public relations, thought it was risky.
It should not surprise us that corporate allegiance to profits will trump their allegiance to any flag. A recent U.S. Treasury Department report revealed that in 1 week alone, 57 U.S. corporations were fined for trading with official enemies of the United States, including terrorists, tyrants.
This was an important last-minute addition, and it was sort of added at the end, because a lot of people said, well, yeah, you show all that stuff going on in the 1930s and 40s, but, is that still happening today? So it was important to show that this kind of complicity of major corporations with some quite dubious political regimes still indeed goes on today.
Makes it his job to study these things. Well, for one thing, avoid the comfortable idea that the mere form of government can of itself safeguard a nation against despotism.
For big business, despotism was often a useful tool for securing foreign markets and pursuing profits. One of the U.S. Marine Corps' most highly decorated generals, Smedley Darlington Butler, by his own account, helped pacify Mexico for American oil companies, Haiti and Cuba for National City Bank, Nicaragua for the Brown Brothers Broker.
This is one of my favorite stories.
Republic for sugar interests, Honduras.
It really shows that it can happen here.
And China for Standard
That
Oil.
business interests were interested in supporting a coup to effectively overthrow the U.S. government and install a fascist dictator.
The Depression, through public enterprise and tougher regulations on corporate exploitation and misdeeds.
More power to you, President Roosevelt. The entire country's behind you, thrilled with hope and patriotism.
But the country was not entirely behind the populist president. Large parts of the corporate elite despised what Roosevelt's New Deal stood for.
Anybody who's interested in reading further about this story, the sort of seminal book is The Plot to Seize the White House by Jules Archer.
To use as a bluff or as a club at least to intimidate the government.
But the corporate cabal had picked the wrong man. Butler was fed up with being what he called a gangster for capitalism.
I appeared before the Congressional Committee, the highest representation of the American people, under subpoena to tell what I knew of activities which I believe might lead to an attempt to set up a fascist dictatorship. The upshot of the whole thing was that I was supposed to lead an organization of 500,000 men, which would be able to take over the functions of government.
A congressional committee ultimately found evidence of a plot to overthrow Roosevelt. According to Butler, the conspiracy included representatives of some of America's top corporations, including J.P. Morgan, DuPont, and Goodyear Tire.
What I find incredible is that this story isn't more widely known. It certainly isn't in high school textbooks on American history.
For corporations to dominate government, a coup is no longer necessary.
Corporations have gone global. And by going global, the governments have lost some control over corporations, regardless of whether the corporation can be trusted or cannot be trusted. Governments today do not have over the corporations the power that they had and the leverage that they had 50 or 60 years ago. And that's a major change. So governments have become powerless compared to where they were before.
Capitalism today commands the towering heights and has displaced politics and politicians as the new high priests and reigning oligarchs of our system. So capitalism and its principal protagonists and players, corporate CEOs, have been accorded unusual power and access. This is not to deny the significance of government and politicians.
So it's a very American coup. They never needed bullets. They never needed to march on Washington. But corporations have ended up taking over government without a military coup.
I remember standing there in this room and looking over on one side of the room, and we had CIA, NSA, DIA, FBI, Customs, Secret Service, and then on the other side of the room we had Coca-Cola, Mobil Oil, GTE, and Kodak. And I remember thinking, I am like in the epicenter of the intelligence industry right now. I mean, the line is not just blurring, it's just not there anymore. And to me, it spoke volumes as to how industry and government were consulting with each other and working with each other.
The Summit of the Americas, which took place in Quebec City, was another instance of anti-globalization kind of protest that we've seen fairly frequently in the late 90s and the early 2000s. In Seattle, we saw it in Vancouver at the APEC meeting in 1997. That was probably the first major one in North America. In Europe, in Prague, in Genoa, in Washington, D.C. And for me, especially the one at APEC in Vancouver was particularly surprising to me because it really was the first time in North America that people were hitting the streets and protesting corporate power. And I was under the impression in the mid-1990s that most students were sort of more concerned with their stock portfolios and what the real estate market was doing. It seemed to be a real sort of conservative kind of shift. And yet, in 1997, there was this explosion of activism, of protest over the increasingly corporatized global order, and that has just continued with the Battle of Seattle at the WTO meeting and others. I think this is a very welcome development because it's people who are being activated, who are doing what citizens do in a democracy, and that is protesting, demonstrating when they feel that is the only way to have their voices heard. At the same time, there's a tendency in the anti-globalization movement that concerns me at least a bit, and that is there tends to be a sense among at least some quarters in the anti-globalization movement that there's really not much point dealing with the more traditional institutions of democracy anymore. That it's really the only effective measures are to confront corporations directly in the streets through non-governmental organizations, and there seems to be this kind of abandonment of government and of working in the traditional institutions of democracy, in political parties, in government, in order to try to create a better world and in order to try to contain corporate power. And I think this is a big mistake because ultimately it's government that creates corporations, that creates economies, that creates the legal framework through which corporations exist, and it's governments that have the authority to actually contain the powers of corporations, to take measures to protect the public interest from corporate power. I do have a concern that if we abandon the traditional domains of democracy, that we basically leave government to corporations and to corporate interests and have no real other way of checking their power.
Recognizes that. But that accountability is in the marketplace. It's with their shareholders. It's with the public perception and the public image that they are projecting. That's if companies don't do what they should be doing, they're going to be punished in the marketplace, and that's not what any company wants.
There's a new market. These guys and gals aren't out.
This idea that is being put forward by Ira Jackson and others, this idea that we don't really need government anymore, that corporations will be accountable to their shareholders and they'll be accountable to consumers, and that somehow the notion of democratic governmental regulation isn't needed because the market will take care of everything. I think this is highly problematic. I think it sounds kind of nice in the abstract. People like Mark Moody Stewart, like Ira Jackson saying, look, corporations are going to respond to your concerns. If you want a cleaner environment, if you want better working conditions, use your power as consumers. Support those companies that have good environmental policies and don't buy products from those companies that have bad environmental policies. The problem with that model, well, there are lots of problems with that model, but one of the most substantial problems with that model is that the market isn't democratic. The notion that we should rely on corporations' accountability to shareholders and to consumers means that we basically give up on the idea, the central idea in a democracy, that every individual should have the same number of votes. If we're relying on shareholders, much of the population doesn't own shares at all, and among those people who do, some own many shares and others don't. So if the notion is that our structures of accountability are through shareholders, then we have a very skewed and very unequal kind of electorate. Namely, those people who own lots of shares and who have lots of wealth have a lot more power. And the same with consumption, the same with consumers. Many people have very little consumer power at all, especially when you get outside of the industrialized countries. And so the notion that we should rely upon consumers to constrain corporate action, again, creates this highly skewed kind of so-called democracy. There are many other problems with the model as well, and that is, how are consumers supposed to know what's going on in corporations, especially what kinds of harms are being caused by corporations, especially when you have the media itself being a relatively ineffective tool for revealing corporate harms. So this idea that somehow we don't need government anymore, we don't need government regulation, we can rely on the market, I think is a very dangerous idea. And I think it's an idea that's often twinned with corporate social responsibility, in that many corporations say, look, we are socially responsible now. We are responding to demands that we be better to the environment, better to workers, and so on. And therefore, you don't need to regulate us anymore. We don't need government regulation anymore. So I think often social responsibility is being offered as an alternative to social regulation. And that, to me, is a very dangerous idea if we buy into it.